All is ready. And now we shall harness the power of the heavens themselves to infuse my creation with the spark of life. Igor, throw the switch.
I keep telling you, my name is Fritz.
Are you sure? You really look like an Igor.
I'm very sure of my own name.
Okay, Fritz then. Throw the switch! Greetings, everyone, and welcome to another Halloween horror movie review. Well, today we continue our look at the Universal Monsters legacy with 1931's Frankenstein, starring Boris Karloff, Colin Clive, Edward Van Sloan is in it again, and directed by James Whale. So, yeah, this one, I got a lot to say about this one, because want to see how it compares to the book and any significant changes they've made, of course, much as I've been doing with the Dracula ones. B, want to talk about just the movie in general and how it is as a movie. And C, how influential this particular movie has been on all the Frankenstein movies that have followed. So we got a lot to cover, so let's get right to it. Frankenstein, 1931, today on the Multimedia Chronicles. Welcome back. Well, after the success of Dracula, Universal was keen to repeat the success. But this was not the days of sequels. Nowadays, Hollywood is like, well, this one was successful, let's make a second one of the same thing. No, back then the philosophy was a little bit different. It was more like, well, this book adaptation of this classic monster story was successful. What's a different classic monster story book that we can adapt into a film? So, and they kind of carried on like that. So they did, they did Dracula, they did Frankenstein, they did The Invisible Man. They came up with their own story for The Mummy and The Wolfman. Now, eventually they did catch on to the idea of sequels only a few years. I mean, Bride of Frankenstein came out 4 years after this one. But at the time, they were keen to kind of expand a little bit. I mean, the movies weren't even referred to as horror movies. It wasn't actually until 1934 that the term horror was coined as a subgenre of its own. At the time, they were just movies, shocking, spine-tingling terror experiences and such. And but there wasn't really a horror genre. It wasn't until later that they kind of started using that term. Now, Bela Lugosi had made quite an impression as Dracula, so much so that he was actually Universal's #1 choice to have as the monster in Frankenstein. In fact, they actually shot a test reel with an early version of the Frankenstein makeup with Bela Lugosi as the monster. It also co-starred good old Edward Van Sloan again. I don't know if he was playing Dr. Frankenstein or just some other character. I would assume he was playing Dr. Frankenstein in that. But sadly, that test footage is gone. It no longer exists. It's considered a lost film. What we do have, however, is this, which is a movie poster that was done around the same time, where they thought Bela would be a shoo-in as the creature, but as it turned out, I guess shortly after that test footage, Bela Lugosi decided that he didn't really want to play the monster. As he put it, he didn't want to play a scarecrow because he was a big star in his own country. He also didn't want to do it because the monster didn't have any dialogue. He didn't feel it was a very interesting character that really stretched his acting talents, so he declined the role. So instead, it of course went to Boris Karloff, who at the time had been in Hollywood for about 10 years or so, and had kind of made a small name for himself playing bad guys and heavies in just a variety of films, mostly bit parts. So when he was offered the chance to play the monster, essentially one of the main characters in this adaptation of one of the most beloved gothic horror stories of all time, he jumped at the opportunity and he gave it his all, man. I mean, he withstood those hours upon hours in the makeup chair as Jack Pierce, pioneer of movie makeup, was putting on all the appliances and the makeup. He even took out his bridge work to have one cheek slightly more sunken. So if you've noticed how he looks very gaunt, part of that is because he actually took some of his teeth out to have his cheek more sunken and look a little more cadaverous. So that's dedication to the art, man. So right off the top, we should talk about how faithful is it to the original book. Well, much like how Dracula was an adaptation of a stage play, which itself was an adaptation of the book, same goes for Frankenstein. It was an adaptation of a stage play, which itself was an adaptation of the book. Now, there were quite a number of alterations. In some of the Dracula reviews, I've talked about how they like to flip the names of Lucy and Mina a lot for some reason. I don't know why. Well, by a similar token here, instead of being named Victor Frankenstein, they named him Henry Frankenstein. Now, in the book, Victor's best friend was named Henry. In this one, Henry's best friend is named Victor. The reason the studio gave for the change was that they felt the name Victor was too severe for American audiences to have as their lead character, so they basically swapped those two names. Now, in the book, Henry's last name was Clerval. In the movie, his last name is Moritz. Now, you may think that just kind of came out of nowhere, but no. In the book, there's actually a character named Justine Moritz, a female character, who is quite important and the subject of a pretty major subplot of the book. But in this case, there's no mention of that character or that subplot whatsoever. They basically just cribbed the name and slapped it on with Henry. I guess just a very minor nod to that by having that his last name. Now, in the movie, Henry Frankenstein is assisted by his hunchbacked assistant, Fritz. Now, again, you may think that name just kind of came out of nowhere, but no, there's actually a character named Fritz in the book. Now, in the book, Fritz is just this really nice young man who lives with his sister and his blind father, and the monster kind of encounters them. And again, pretty major subplot in the book, so Fritz is a pretty big part of that. In this case, it's just they cribbed the name for the hunchbacked assistant. Now, this is where things get kind of interesting, because the sort of standard trope is that the hunchbacked assistant was named Igor, and that's kind of become ingrained in the mass consciousness ever since. But Igor, in the movies, was not an assistant to Dr. Frankenstein at all. He was actually a criminal that was hanged unsuccessfully. He actually survived the hanging, and we don't meet him until Son of Frankenstein, so 2 more movies down the line. Also, that particular Igor was not a hunchback. He did have a partly broken neck and like a big lump of bone on the side of his neck, but he was not a hunchback. Fritz is a hunchback. So it's kind of like over the course of time, the mass consciousness has fused these two characters together. So everybody remembers the hunchbacked assistant and for some reason thinks he was named Igor. Well, he wasn't. That character that everybody remembers never actually existed. It exists now because we've had a lot of Frankenstein movies, and well, there was even a movie called Igor where being an Igor was a career choice. You could be an Igor or you could be a mad scientist. And if you were an Igor, you were always an assistant to the mad scientist. So it was the story of an Igor who wanted to be a mad scientist. It's a wonderful family movie. Great fun with John Cusack as the voice of the main character. But that whole concept is based on the trope of Igor, the hunchbacked assistant to Dr. Frankenstein. And that character has never actually existed in the actual old movies that they are purporting to be paying homage to. So it's kind of strange when you think about it. Just where do these things come from? It's like the mass consciousness took bits and pieces of these different things and smushed them together into this one gestalt character that has become the way everybody remembers it. I don't know. I find things like that fascinating when you kind of trace things back to their roots and find out that the roots are completely different from what you expected them to be. There's going to be quite a few examples of that over the course of these Halloween reviews, by the way, because I've noticed a lot of such things in my explorations of the movies and my explorations of the books, and we'll talk about them as we get to them. So let's talk about the movie here, and I'll point out some of the differences between the movie and the book as we go. I guess one of the big ones is any references to Fritz. Yeah, Fritz, the hunchbacked assistant, named Fritz or otherwise, is not in the book. In the book, Frankenstein operates entirely by himself. He does everything on his own and doesn't tell anyone how or why or whatever. He keeps it all to himself and does it all himself. So the movie opens with Dr. Frankenstein and Fritz basically robbing a grave, digging up the grave and looking for body parts for his experiment in creating life. Now, in the book, we don't get to that point for a very, very long time. We actually get quite a backstory of Victor Frankenstein and his schooling and his education and the origins of his obsession with creating life and whatnot, where that all came from, and some of the science that he was learning that he felt could be applied to that idea. But no, in this case, we just jump right in. He's already robbing graves and scooping up body parts to put together his perfect being. So Henry has essentially set up his laboratory in an old abandoned watchtower. It's this massive stone tower, and he has his laboratory on the upper levels of it, and there's sort of a big massive foyer, and then there's a basement downstairs. And his fiancée, Elizabeth Lavenza. In the book, it was Elizabeth Frankenstein, because, well, depending which version you read. If you read the 1818 version, they were cousins. If you read the 1831 version, she was an orphan that he just called his cousin, and then they knew each other since they were kids, they fell in love, and then ultimately were going to get married. In this one, she's just his fiancée. We don't really find out any backstory there or delve into that at all. And honestly, it doesn't really matter because that aspect of it isn't important. So Elizabeth is worried because Henry's been kind of losing touch with her and just keeping to himself and working on his experiments. So she and Victor go to see Dr. Waldman, played by Edward Van Sloan. Dr. Waldman was one of Henry's old professors who helped to teach him a lot of the scientific stuff that he knows. So Dr. Waldman apparently is quite privy to the experiments that Henry Frankenstein is working on. He says, oh yeah, he's trying to create life. So, you know, his experiments were deemed kind of immoral and such, and we basically booted him out of the university. So they're all worried, they're all concerned, because Henry's kind of been cutting himself off from everybody. So they go to the watchtower to see what's up. And Fritz at first refuses to let them in, but eventually Henry relents and lets them in. Now this is where different versions of the story alter. In some versions, it's just Frankenstein alone doing the experiment. In others, it's Frankenstein with an assistant or two doing the experiment, but shunning his family and friends away. In this one, he actually lets them come upstairs to the lab and watch the experiment as he's doing the final preparations, and he's about to bring the monster to life. So Dr. Waldman, Victor, and Elizabeth all bear witness to the experiment as it happens. So speaking of the experiment, in the book, we really don't know how Frankenstein manages to bring the monster to life. It never goes into it. And the reason for that is very simple. Now, you need to understand sort of who the narrator actually is in the book. In the book, it's actually the sea captain, Robert Walton, who, like Frankenstein, was very obsessive about his passions. In his case, he wanted to make his way to the North Pole and be renowned in history as the first to reach the North Pole. So his boat gets stuck in the ice, and then in the book, Victor Frankenstein is actually tracking down the creature. They're actually going to head off for their final battle. And Frankenstein happens across the ship, stuck in the ice. They take him in, and Victor proceeds to tell Robert Walton his story. And that's where we get into everything that happened leading up to that point. So really, who the narrator is in the book is Robert Walton writing down everything that Victor Frankenstein is telling him. So the importance of that is it's not Mary Shelley who has not told us the techniques that Victor Frankenstein used to bring his creature to life. No. It's Victor Frankenstein himself who has chosen not to tell us because he doesn't want anyone else following his work or continuing where he left off or doing the same thing. So for this reason, it's very vague in the book. So one chapter literally ends with, I finally figured it out, I knew how to do it, I was going to create life. And then the very beginning of the next chapter is, the creature opened its eyes, I had created life, and I put my instruments away. and that's it. That's all you get. It doesn't tell you anything. There's some vague allusions to him using chemistry and particular combinations of chemicals, but it doesn't go into any detail. And it makes perfect sense when you think about it, because he doesn't want anybody else to do what he did, to make the mistakes that he did and be damned like he is. So he deliberately omits that from his telling the story to Walton. Now, why that's significant in terms of the movies is it leaves things wide open for the movies to do whatever the heck they want. So the whole thing about the mad scientist laboratory bringing the creature to life, that comes from this. That originated with this. Even the 1910 Edison version kind of keeps it vague and just basically has the has like the monster reverse melt out of a pot of chemicals. But this one is the one where we got the whole thing with the mad scientist laboratory, all the crazy electrical devices zapping and popping and snapping and crackling all over the place, and the whole idea that it's electricity that provides the spark of life. That's from this. And pretty much every Frankenstein adaptation since has borrowed that from this. It's not from the book. The book is chemistry. Electricity is from this. So in this case, we get treated to a pretty elaborate bringing the monster to life scene. I mean, it's great. There's just crazy stuff going on all over the place, flipping big massive switches and lightning and zapping and exploding, and it's quite spectacular. And then, of course, he brings the creature down, checks it, and sure enough, it's alive. And he just, like, loses his mind. He's like, it's alive! It's great. Just the sheer elation in his voice that it worked, that it was successful. It is amazing. I mean, Colin Clive just really just gives it his all as Dr. Frankenstein. He's just a fantastic actor. I love his performance in this. So in this case, because everyone he knows is privy to the experiment, pretty much all of them just kind of stick around and help him out. In particular, Victor and Dr. Waldman hang around and help him with the monster. So we get our first look at the monster. He emerges from the basement. You just hear the slow, plodding footsteps. And he steps through the door. And we see those dead, almost lifeless eyes and the gaunt face and just the tall, towering presence of this creature. And I've always said that the subtlety in Boris Karloff's performance as the monster is just fantastic. I mean, as an actor, I think he was given very little to work with as far as how to portray the monster, but he really succeeded in making it a very sympathetic character in a lot of ways, and really conveyed that sort of childlike naivete and just lack of knowledge and lack of experience. Everything is new to him. So we have Dr. Frankenstein just kind of leading him around and stuff like that, and everything seems to be going well. He plays some music for him, and there's this wonderful moment where the monster has never heard music before, and he's trying to sort of figure out what it is, and it's almost like he's reaching for the air, like he's almost trying to pluck the notes out of the air. You know, it's great. It's just a wonderful little moment. And then good old Fritz comes bumbling into the room carrying a torch, and the monster freaks out, like just freaks, because it's terrified of fire. He doesn't know what it is. Plus, I mean, Fritz isn't exactly subtle. He just kind of bursts into the room carrying this flaming torch, getting right all up in the monster's face, and the monster flips out. So they manage to subdue the monster, and then the next thing we know, he's in chains in the basement. Dr. Frankenstein has concluded that the creature is dangerous and cannot be taught. He finds out that Fritz got the wrong brain. He was supposed to get a healthy brain. Instead, he messed that up. He dropped it, so he just grabbed the next brain that was there, which is an abnormal one. And interestingly enough, there's a little conversation that he has with Dr. Waldman. where Waldman is asking, well, what brain did you use? And he says, well, you should know, doctor. It was in your presentation yesterday, because he had given a presentation to some students about the differences between healthy and abnormal brains. So he essentially concludes that even though he managed to bring the creature to life, that the experiment is ultimately a failure because the creature is uncontrollable. It's just savage and can't be reasoned with or taught or anything, which is kind of unfair to the creature, honestly, because they haven't really tried. There was one incident where it had the perfectly natural reaction of recoiling in terror from fire, and they misconstrued that as an attack or violence on the part of the creature. But really, it was just reacting in self-defense. It was scared. So Frankenstein's kind of at a loss. He doesn't know what to do. And meanwhile, in the basement, Fritz is tormenting the creature by waving a torch in its face. And the creature is just like, it's chained up. It can't escape. So he's just like cowering into the corner, and he's terrified to the point of like almost mental break. Like he's so scared. And you can see that on his face. Like he's just contorted in sheer absolute terror. And then finally, the adrenaline rush of sheer terror and panic, he manages to break free of his chains. Meanwhile, upstairs, Waldman and Frankenstein are having a conversation. They hear this blood-curdling scream come from downstairs. They rush down, and they see the creature throttling Fritz. Fritz is dead. So now they're just like, oh crap, the creature's now a murderer. What are we going to do? So they run back upstairs, manage to slam the door shut before the creature gets them. And they're like, what are we going to do? And then both Waldman and Frankenstein conclude, well, the creature needs to be destroyed. There's no question. It's too dangerous. We can't let it live. It needs to be destroyed. So Waldman says, well, okay, I'll put together a tranquilizer. You open the door and distract him, and then I'll jab him with the tranquilizer. We'll take him back to the lab, and we'll basically dissect him. Done. So they open the door. The creature immediately lunges for Frankenstein, and then Waldman jabs it with the tranquilizer. The creature turns on Waldman, is about to lunge at him, and then the tranquilizer kicks in. I'm guessing it was a pretty powerful one, like probably to drop an elephant. And then again, this wonderful, subtle moment in Karloff's performance where he's just like totally uncomprehending of what's happening. He just like, his consciousness is fading, and he just can't understand why. So he's just like kind of waving his hand in front of his face, and then eyes roll back into his head, and he just collapses. So Waldman assures Frankenstein that he will take care of everything. He can just go off and get married. So Frankenstein goes off to prepare for his wedding to Elizabeth, while meanwhile Waldman basically prepares to dissect the creature. Unfortunately, the creature wakes up. Guess that tranquilizer wasn't quite strong enough, breaks free of his bonds, and kills Waldman. The creature manages to break out of the basement and is now free, roaming the countryside, running amok. Now, for the record, absolutely none of any of this happened in the book. None of it. Not even close. Well, Frankenstein does go off to get married at one point, but Waldman has nothing to do with him through pretty much any of it other than his early education. The wedding actually doesn't happen until quite a bit later in the story, and the creature actually escapes and ends up free and roaming the world pretty much right after it's created in the book. There's not a lot of time spent with Frankenstein and the creature. It's just he kind of abandons it right away and then comes back and it's gone. And then, he just kind of carries on with his life. It's very strange. Anyway, so the creature's wandering around, and we have this lovely little scene where he encounters the young girl, Maria. A couple of cute little behind-the-scenes stories with that scene, by the way. Some of the crew was concerned that she might be scared seeing Boris Karloff in full monster makeup and weren't quite sure how to deal with that. So they're all getting into their cars to go to the location to film the scene, and she sees Boris Karloff in full monster makeup, and without a moment's hesitation, she runs up to him, and she's like totally like just taken with him. And it's like, can I ride with you? And Boris Karloff, just ever the consummate gentleman, just leans down and says, "Oh, would you, darling?" So she rode to the location in the car with the monster. So clearly not scared at all. I mean, Come on, kids love monsters. And, I mean, what a wonderful story that must have been for her to tell her grandchildren years later. It's like, yeah, I rode in the car with Boris Karloff in full monster makeup as the Frankenstein monster. So when they actually did the scene where, of course, the monster meets the girl, and they're throwing flowers into the water, and then they run out of flowers, and the monster's kind of looking around for something else to throw in the water. He ends up throwing the girl in, not realizing that she can't swim, and she drowns, and then the monster panics and leaves because he doesn't know what to do. Well, the little girl playing Maria apparently had only had about 3 swimming lessons in her entire life at that point, and she'd never been underwater before. So, but she was a trooper, and she did several takes of it, actually, of being tossed into the water. And then James Whale said he wanted her to do one more take, but she was, tired and wet, and he says, well, I'll tell you what, if you do one more take, I'll get you anything you want. Anything at all. And she said, 12 hard-boiled eggs. Apparently hard-boiled eggs were one of her favorite treats. So she did one more take. That's the take that's in the movie. And James Whale gave her 24 hard-boiled eggs. Like, how awesome is that? Like, it just sounds like it was such a happy set, You kind of contrast that with the Dracula set, which wasn't necessarily an unhappy set, but it was definitely a more tense set, largely due to the personal issues that Todd Browning was going through at the time. He was very tense and on edge through a lot of it. But this just sounds like it was such a relaxed, fun, happy set where everybody got along really well, and just so many little charming behind-the-scenes stories like that, which is just wonderful. So meanwhile, Henry's preparing for the wedding. Elizabeth is getting ready. They just they chat for a little bit, and then Henry gets called away. Says something horrible's happened. Professor Waldman has been killed. And then, Frankenstein realizes, oh crap, no, the monster's, it must have been the monster. The monster's probably on the loose now. This is no good. So, meanwhile, Elizabeth has been left alone. The monster climbs in through the window and advances on her. And as Henry is talking to the other guys, they hear this blood-curdling scream come from Elizabeth's room. And it's like, oh my God, Elizabeth! So they go running back. The creature's gone, but Elizabeth is passed out on the bed. She's still alive, though. That's a big difference from the book, because the monster does show up on their wedding day, but in the book, he actually kills Elizabeth. There's a whole big subplot as to why that's been just completely done away with. And it's just kind of a random thing. How did he know that they were there? There's just so many questions that I have about this that will never be answered. But in the book, there's a very good reason for the creature to be there, and a very good reason for him to have killed Elizabeth as well. But maybe we'll get into that in some of the other adaptations that actually do include that story. Meanwhile, there's a huge celebration in the streets, big party, big festival, everybody's having a good time, and then there's this man comes walking through the crowd. And it's Maria's father, who we saw earlier when he said goodbye to her when she was playing by the water. And he's carrying the limp form of his dead daughter in his arms. And the look on his face is just like he's died inside. Like everything that meant everything to him in the world is now gone. So he's carrying the limp, lifeless form of his child to the burgomaster, who's like the head of the town, and say, my little girl is dead. And he's like, well, why have you brought her here? And he's like, because she was murdered. And then Frankenstein is there, and he's like, I know who did it. It was the creature, blah, blah. And basically kind of comes clean about some of it anyway, that he knows who the murderer is. It's a, horrible creature, and they have to find it and kill it. So then, we have the birth of another trope, the mob of angry, torch-wielding villagers, which we've seen so many times since. Well, again, this is basically where that started. Now, that one everybody remembers the right way, because, how can you misremember a mob of angry villagers, right? So they take to the hills in search of the creature. And it was funny, I was watching this with Rosie. We watched the first 3 Frankenstein movies together, and both of us noticed something about the chase through the mountains. The background is supposed to look like this stormy, cloudy sky. But you can tell, clear as day, that it's actually just a gigantic curtain with a stormy, cloudy sky painted on it. And the reason you can tell that is because there's actually creases in the curtain. Oops. But it's interesting because I've seen even modern productions that use that technique. Maybe a little more careful about hiding the creases. But it's interesting because it creates the feeling of it being a stage play almost. Which is interesting to me because this was based on a stage play. So it's almost like they were using sort of stage play set dressing techniques for the movie version as well. Which I guess isn't unusual because, I mean, movies were still fairly new at the time, and a lot of them were adapted from stage plays and books and so forth, and essentially were done as the play on film, you know. But it's funny, both of us noticed that. Anytime there was one of the shots where you could see the creases in the curtains, like, look, curtain! Oh, something I neglected to mention. Is the thing with Maria in the book? No, it is not. However, it does appear that it is a nod to another little bit of a subplot in the book where the monster kills a little boy named William. Now, William is actually Victor Frankenstein's younger brother, and he ends up being, sadly, the first victim of the creature's revenge against Victor. So in the book, it's an act of revenge. It's a deliberate murderous act. In the movie, it's not deliberate. The girl has nothing to do with Frankenstein, and it's just kind of an accident. So, whereas in the book, it gets much more complicated in terms of switching back and forth between the monster wanting to be accepted but being shunned by society, and then ultimately deciding that vengeance is the only course of action that it can get any kind of satisfaction from. It's far more complicated than that. We're not going to go into it now. Whereas in this case, they played it more just sticking to the sympathetic side. Also, I should mention, in the book, the creature can speak. He's actually quite articulate and quite well-spoken, almost Shakespearean, like that well-spoken. But in the movie, he's just, growls and grunts and moans and groans and such. And again, that's become kind of the trope for the monster, that it's this unspeaking, sort of dumb beast of a creature. But in the book, that was not the case at all. He started off that way, but over the course of the story, he learns. He learns to speak, he learns to read, learns to articulate himself. And that's a very integral part of the character. So it's a shame that so many of the movies omit that. At least the earlier movies did. So Frankenstein separates off from the main group and ends up bumping into the monster. The monster and him duke it out for a little bit. The monster knocks him unconscious and then carries him off towards the windmill. The monster and Henry have a final confrontation out on kind of a balcony on the windmill. The monster picks up Frankenstein and throws him off the windmill, but he gets caught on one of the arms of the windmill and manages to slide down to the ground. So he's injured, but he's not dead. So some of the villagers kind of pull Frankenstein free, and then they set the windmill ablaze. The windmill goes up, and it fades away. So as far as we know, the monster burned to death in the windmill. The last we see of the monster is he's trapped under a falling beam, and things are on fire all around him. You just figure, okay, that's it. He's done for. Or is he? Well, we'll have to wait until Bride of Frankenstein to find out what happens next. Now that said, Bride of Frankenstein actually is also an adaptation of the book, in a way, because this one actually only adapts a very small part of the book, and again, it changes the story so much that the few parts that it does include are so small that it leaves huge chunks of the book left unadapted. So they do adapt some of those aspects of them in the second movie, but we'll talk about that when we get to it. So yeah, definitely a different take on the story, but the thing is, despite the fact that this is considerably different from the book, this just works so well as a film. It is so beautifully shot and just phenomenally acted. Oh, I'm always hyping up Edward Van Sloan. Remember I was talking about how in Dracula they had originally filmed an intro where he was warning the audience, but sadly that footage has been lost. Well, he did another one for Frankenstein, and that one is included. It is there. This also does have the famous line that was omitted for a long time after Frankenstein brings the monster to life. He says, "Now I know what it's like to be God." That was cut out of a lot of issues of the film, but was later restored for the DVD release, and it was further restored and cleaned up. They found a cleaner recording on a Vitaphone recording, apparently. So they were able to lift that and tidy it up. You can still tell the audio quality is still slightly rougher than the rest of the audio, but it's so minor you won't really even notice unless you're looking for it. Of course, now that I pointed it out, you're all going to be looking for it. Sorry, I ruined it. So James Whale would go on to direct 3 more Universal horror movies. He originally took this one on because he kind of wanted to break away from all the war movies and such that he was kind of being known for and do something different. So the irony there is now he's no longer known as that guy who directed a bunch of war movies. He's known as the guy who directed 4 of the all-time greatest Universal monster movies ever. What were the other 3? Well, keep watching. We'll talk about them when we get to them. Alrighty, I think that about covers the first Frankenstein. So pretty interesting in all the changes that were made from the book, but also all of the tropes that are now considered kind of standard tropes of the Frankenstein story that actually originated with the movie and not the book. Pretty interesting stuff. This is one of the things I'm really enjoying about doing these. Now that I've read the books and also watching not only these movies, but a lot of the other adaptations as well, seeing where all these different things have come from, like kind of tracing back the origins. It's awesome. I love this stuff. Alrighty, that is it from me to you for now, folks. Hope you enjoyed. We'll see you in the next one. We got a long way to go. We're probably going to go into overtime, but I got quite a stack of movies that I've watched and just haven't filmed the reviews yet. I got to do the reviews and get all this stuff out of my head and make room for other stuff. Alrighty, so thanks for watching. Big thanks to my Patreon sponsors, and we'll see you in the next one, whatever it is. Until then, sayonara.